doing QQ number 5, and for the readings today, I noticed an interplay between the concepts of cooperation or solidarity among oppressed groups and the possibility for these groups to simultaneously oppress one another. So for example, the women's rights movement and the abolition movement, they coincided both spatially and temporally, and many women's rights activists also took up the cause of abolition. So in some ways there was synergy between the movements. The pieces that we read by Stewart and Truth certainly demonstrated the work of Black women in fighting for both causes, and white women also played a part in the intersection of feminism and abolition. However, some of the quotes from the Ain't I a Woman speech and also Stewart's feminist publications pointed out the potential for racial divisions to perpetuate oppression of Black women, sometimes even by other white women. So the first example that stuck out to me was actually the small excerpt from right after Ain't I a Woman, where the National Park Service noted that another version was published a month after the speech was given in the Anti-Slavery Bugle by Marius Robinson, and in Robinson's version, the phrase Ain't I a Woman was not present. So to me, this sounds like a really blatant effort to get rid of the audible Black vernacular in the speech, basically to make it more acceptable for white feminism. And it reminds me of the way that activists in the early LGBT movements, Black trans women, their work was later obscured by other LGBTQ activists, mostly white ones. So in a way, the efforts of Black activists are only accepted if they're cleaned up and made acceptable and don't challenge too many lines of oppression all at one time. Similarly, on page 1035 of the discussion about Stewart's activist work, it's noted that Stewart should have been acknowledged by the European American women activists who followed in her footsteps. Racism and perhaps also social class prejudice caused them to pass over her in favor of the white and upper class Grimké sisters. So basically here we have the same principle. While quite a few women's rights activists were also abolitionists, when it came down to it, a lot of white feminists didn't want their success to be challenged by Black women tagging along with additional demands. So this whole discussion reminded me of an article that I read by Tran on the idea of calling out and calling in. So a lot of us know what calling out is. It's when we tell somebody that they've offended us, maybe and get angry, maybe even cancel them if you want to use the words that we like to throw around today. But Tran offered the idea of calling in, which is like a gentler version of calling out, and you use it when someone you trust perpetuates oppressive ideas or offends you in some way. So calling in lets you tell someone what they've done wrong, but it also lets you help them learn from their mistakes and also to grow so that they don't do it again in the future. So you can call someone in when you trust them and when you share some experiences, but also when they acknowledge that they might have additional identity characteristics that cause some people within an oppressed group to maintain privilege over others. So the juxtaposition, wow, I love that word, of this modern concept with the really old writings we looked at for today makes me wonder, in the case of white women treading on Black women's work in the early women's rights movements, would calling in have been useful? Could white women respond by acknowledging their racism and white privilege? And could they do so enough to change their ways? Granted, Black women had every right to be angry and call out white women for their offense, but I like to believe that some of these white women were willing to learn and to change their oppressive actions towards people of color. So this would require women to acknowledge when they have become ignorant of their own internalized oppressive mindsets. Grimké at least made some progress towards this acknowledgement in her letter on the equality of the sexes. She wrote, "I am aware that I have the prejudices of education and custom to combat, both in my own and the other sex, as well as the traditions of men, which are taught for the commandments of God." So in this quote, while it mostly addresses internalized misogyny, at least it represents a willingness to unlearn the oppressive ideals that society has naturalized, and so perhaps this idea could have been expanded into unlearning racist ideas as well. Of course, being called in still requires people to trust that fellow activists will be willing to face the discomfort of admitting when they're wrong. So as Astell said on page 849 of A Serious Proposal to the Ladies, "Let me entreat them to consider there's no ignorance so shameful, no folly so absurd, as that which refuses instruction." So basically, you have to be willing to learn and willing to acknowledge your ignorance and say, "I've messed up," in order to be able to change.